Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Smith. I'm a postdoc with Josh Tenenbaum. And as Tommy and Josh mentioned earlier, one of the important parts of CBMM over the next few years is understanding this 3.5D sketch. And one core component of that is physical scene understanding, which is not just localizing where, but understanding the latent attributes, the masses, whether objects are stable, that allow us to make predictions about the future or understand how objects interact. And this center has had a lot of luck over the past few years understanding that through the lens of the intuitive physics engine, which says we can simulate the world forward and read off from those simulations to make decisions, predictions, or inferences about the world. So, for instance, if you want to know whether this tower of blocks is going to fall or in which direction, we run some noisy simulations, and then we look at those simulations to say what proportion of them fell and in what direction. But this isn't the only game in town. If you look over the last 40-odd years of psychological literature, a lot of it's been focused on rule-based physical reasoning. So for instance, to ask whether this balance beam is going to tip to the left, tip to the right, or balance, well, this has been extensively studied and often described as the set of rules that are built up into these decision trees, starting very simple, for instance, just focus on the side with more weight, and developing as children mature. And these rules have been used to explain some characteristic biases in these tasks, such as people prefer to say the side with more weight is going to fall down, even if there's a counterbalancing, less massive object further out on the other side. But you might look at these two tasks and you might say, well, they kind of seem similar. And it pointed out that maybe these balance beams are just kind of a special case of these block towers. Yet in one case, we find that the intuitive physics engine does a very good job of explaining people's behavior. And in another case, it seems like these system of rules do. So what's going on? So that's what I'm studying here in this thrust is trying to figure out what are the strategies people have for physical reasoning and how do we use and combine them. So to do this, we ran our own balance beam experiments, but instead of these diagrammatic beams like you see up there, we gave them more naturalistic stimuli and threw a few more curveballs in as well. So for instance, instead of just being blocks, you'd have to look at these shapes on the beam, or change the material and therefore the weight of some of the blocks, or change the pivot so that it's more like resting on a table or it's off-center. And across all three of these experiments, what we found was that people still showed this characteristic bias that that they prefer the side with more weight was going to fall down. So we can't explain this with an unbiased intuitive physics. But similarly, if we apply the same rule-based systems that have been used in the psychological literature in the past, we also can't explain people's behavior. So what's going on here? Well, our idea is that we shouldn't treat this as an either intuitive physics engine or rules, but rather consider this as people have various tools that they can bring to bear understand scenes, and they form them into strategies that they can apply to get answers out about the world and understand what's going on. So we built a model of this where people take a noisy perception of the scene and then probabilistically choose between strategies that they can apply to this noisy perception and get an answer of what's going to happen. Is it going to fall left, right, or balance? And the two strategies that we found people seem to use, the first one is they look at the balance beam, they say, does it look roughly symmetric? In that case, it's going to balance. If not, I'm going to kick it to my physics engine and get an answer from there. Second strategy, look at it for symmetry. If it balances, great. If not, say, does one side have noticeably more weight? If so, then that side's going to fall down. Otherwise, kick the engine, get an answer there. And if we look across all of the different experiments and all of the different conditions, we find a very good correspondence between people's predictions and our model. So in each of these different panels, this is one of the conditions per experiment. The black bar is the proportion of people who think the beam is going to fall left, balance, or right, and the red dots are the model predictions for those same conditions. And you can see that we seem to be capturing very well what people are doing across this wide range of stimuli. But this leaves us with a question of, well, why these two strategies? Why is it these that people are using? And for that, we turn to this idea of rational metacognition and the value of computation, which we find as the expected value of applying a strategy to a problem minus the cognitive or time costs of using that strategy. So in other words, what this is saying is you don't always want to use your best strategy if it's very costly, and you have a cheaper and maybe not quite as good strategy you could use instead. So is this what? Well, we don't necessarily know the underlying costs of applying, say, the symmetry rule, weight rule, or simulation, but we can look over a large regime of costs and say, well, what strategies seem to be the most rational under this framework with those cost regimes? So we did that, and what we find is in certain cases where the costs are very high, well, it's not worth it to even apply any effort. You're not really getting any good return, so you should just guess. When the costs are very low, well, it's almost like it's costless. You just always want to use the best strategy. But in this middle realm, what we find is a lot of circumstances where it seems like the two strategies that people are using are the best ones to use. So this assumption that people are in this middle cost regime, it seems like people are getting a pretty good return on their cognitive investment. So to sum up, when we think about intuitive physics reasoning, we shouldn't treat it as this monolithic entity, but instead consider what are the different strategies people have to bring to bear, and how do we choose to use and combine them. Thank you.